Nick Bostrom makes a useful distinction between global catastrophic risk and existential risk. A nuclear war, for example, would be horrific in its consequences, but nonetheless it seems highly likely that life, intelligent life, would in some sense arise from the ashes. Existential risk, on the other hand, would essentially be the end, let's say, of multicellular life. A 10-kilometre wide asteroid crashing into the planet would presumably obliterate most multicellular life. Another exotic or seemingly exotic form of existential risk that transhumanists consider is the possibility of non-human friendly artificial intelligence, essentially rising in some form of intelligence explosion and simply, for example, converting humans into or atoms and molecules into some other structure for some other purpose. How credible one finds these scenarios is clearly highly debatable. For what it's worth, I still think the most likely form of global catastrophic risk, sadly, is thermonuclear war, that we have become dangerously complacent about the likelihood of war, and whereas if some extremely small states go to war in the 21st century, nuclear weapons may not be used. If, for example, Israel and Iran go to war, India, Pakistan, or, God forbid, the United States and China, there'll be hundreds of millions and possibly billions of casualties. Yes, I'm using the term exotic. I think a significant number of transhumanists would argue that the risk from non-friendly artificial intelligence is not exotic at all. It may be radically counterintuitive, they would argue, but it's not implausible. When transhumanists speak of post-human superintelligence, some, and probably I'm one of this minority, are essentially assuming that recursively self-improving organic robots are going to be self-modifying and bootstrapping our way to superintelligence aided by tool AI. But transhumanists who are focused on the likelihood of an intelligence explosion, non-biological intelligence explosion, consider it highly likely that humanity's successors will not be our biological descendants. Nick and Eliezer of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute particularly focus on so-called paperclipper scenarios. Yes, it is an open question whether the study of existential risk and institutes dedicated to the study of existential risk actually do more good than harm, because clearly there are at least a minority of people who think either that life is a mistake or who are religious millennialists or depressives who if they could take the rest of the world down with them when committing suicide, would do so. And yes, studying existential risk equally gives ideas to those who would use these technologies for their own ends. Yes, I mean, grey goo is the most obvious scenario. Nature has been exploring nanotechnology for aeons, and grey goo scenarios don't seem especially likely. Nonetheless, militarized use of nanotechnology is certainly conceivable. The issue of suffering and the issues of existential risk are quite commonly seen as orthogonal. But I actually see these, the issue of suffering and the issue of existential risk as intimately connected. Essentially, as long as there is a significant minority of people who do not enjoy life, who on balance think it would be best if life didn't exist, not just negative utilitarians, but Buddhists, depressive, a whole spectrum of people, People who do not love life and aren't motivated to preserve it are actually in an era of weapons of mass destruction and biotechnology, themselves a form of existential risk. After all, someone like, I said, I describe myself as a negative utilitarian, and this might seem to be a harmless philosophical position, but one can imagine perhaps certain exotic scenarios which, instead of being inoffensive philosophers, such people are regarded as terrorists. And one worry I have is that a misguided negative utilitarian or misguided depressive, instead of seeking to phase out the biology of suffering via a kind of genetic route that I anticipate as most sociologically credible, would actually seek to take some kind of shortcut. I mean, for example, David Benatar, author of philosopher David Benatar, Better Never to Have Been, essentially argues that coming into existence is essentially a harm, and David Benatar himself urges voluntary childlessness as a way to prevent the harm of Darwinian life, essentially. Essentially, this isn't a viable solution. There would be selection pressure against any predisposition not to have children, selection pressure in favour of any kind of predisposition to go forth and multiply that many religiously minded people have. So this is not a viable solution. But what if someone essentially agrees with David Benatar and thinks, well, this isn't going to work, whereas I can think of various technical solutions that would work, whereas the construction of and delivery systems for thermonuclear weaponry would require state resources. The kind of resources and technical expertise needed to develop a delayed, long latency but extremely lethal pathogen, which can be spread via modern means of transportation. Yes, there are some extremely ugly scenarios one can paint here. I think you see the most likely outcome of anything like this is not what the misguided idealist stroke terrorist intended, but simply suffering on an unimaginable scale. Ooh, big question. I mean, clearly there have been plenty of studies showing that after playing violent video games, children, or not just children, adults are more prone to violent behaviour. Whether they increase existential risk, perhaps I'm more sceptical here. Too many variables here for me to give a confident answer. Yes, perhaps one can envisage scenarios. There was the movie War Games, I believe, in which the protagonist was playing a game under the impression it was simply a game, whereas in fact it was the countdown to some kind of thermonuclear war. I don't know how realistic this was. In terms of existential risk, if and when, as seems quite likely, self-sustaining colonies on Mars and the Moon are established, I think it actually becomes much, much harder to obliterate all intelligent life. And if my main focus were on existential risk, I would prioritise setting up self-sustaining colonies on the Moon and Mars, as well as deep boreholes and scenarios like that. And that once we really do have these self-sustaining colonies, it's much, much harder to erase all sentient life. I'm not particularly concerned about kind of 10-kilometre sized asteroids, because statistically they are extremely rare, and by the time the next large meteorite hits Earth, we will almost certainly, I think, have radiated well beyond well outside the solar system. Yes, if humans were to become extinct, essentially Darwinian life would continue as before, and though one might imagine that sooner or later some species would arise capable of mastering science and technology, rewriting its own source code and compassionately re-engineering the biosphere. I'm skeptical that this is the case. It may well be that only a fabulously improbable succession of of accidents allowed humans to arise. And yes, we are the only species capable of phasing out suffering here on Earth, and indeed, if suffering exists elsewhere within our Hubble volume, going forth and eradicating suffering elsewhere. So in that sense, I think if we're ethically serious, it's important that humans or our successors survive. Here we come into, I suppose, a question of fundamental values and commitments, and I think most people who are aware of the existence of an ethic of negative utilitarianism and aware of the standard counter-argument it would mean, if there were this button, pressing it and wiping out all existence, I think they find this conclusion repugnant. But one way of guarding against status quo bias in response is to actually turn this question on its head. Imagine if you now had the option that you could create a type-identical copy of our multiverse, not merely all its joys, all its good stuff, but Auschwitz and all the nasty, terrible things that happen. Would you press a button and create suffering on an unimaginable scale? Now, even if you would go ahead and press a button and create a duplicate of our multiverse, I think most people would think very long and hard before doing so. And this illustrates the extent to which, status quo bias rather than any careful consideration of the issues is what animates most people's gut reaction here. I think what's important, politics, that's been said, is the art of the possible. And sure, philosophers can sit in their armchairs and dream up utopian solutions, but if something like the abolitionist project, whether top-down or bottom-up or some combination of the two, is to come to fruition, we're going to need to establish the broadest possible consensus. And the World Health Organization, in its founding documents, expresses a commitment to physical, mental, spiritual health, not just in the sense of an absence of disease, but in terms of complete well-being. And so rather than talking about something like negative utilitarianism or even any one particular ethical theory, embracing the World Health Organization conception of health and asking what are the technical conditions necessary for its fulfillment, in principle, given the tremendously wide acceptance something like the World Health Organization enjoys. Essentially, it ought to be possible to build a consensus of Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, secular rationalists, and yes, transhumanists, as the transhumanist movement gains greater traction. The point is that so long as stress is laid on choice and an absence of compulsion, I think in principle at any rate it's possible to build an extremely wide consensus in favour of phasing out suffering. I'm sure right now if you tell someone, look, if you're ethically serious about phasing out suffering, you're going to have to quit eating meat, this is a rather negative response. But if we assume that technology is going to resolve a lot of these problems and that 10, 15 years' time in vitro meat is widely available, essentially we have a question of asking people, well, look, it doesn't involve any personal inconvenience on your part. Do you think any sentient being should be forced to suffer against their will? I think one of the things that would trouble Nick, and it's a perfectly legitimate worry, is that there is this risk of us locking ourselves into some kind of substandard utopia. Nick would very much agree that we should aim to phase out involuntary suffering, but what we don't want to do is to lock ourselves into some kind of Brave New World. Brave New World would be a society in which, yes, we have eliminated involuntary suffering, but nonetheless the maximum potential of life is nowhere near fulfilled. This is it. If one is a native utilitarian or a Buddhist, in some sense one's aspirations for life, the future of life in the universe, are far more stunted than if one has a more radically ambitious conception of what life has to offer. Well, I think it was Nick rather than me who ensured that a commitment to the well-being of all sentience was written into the Transhumanist Declaration. The Transhumanist Declaration is this brief summation of transhumanist principles. The first declaration was agreed upon in 1998. It was reaffirmed most recently in 2009. One might imagine that something like a short, crisp summation of transhumanist principles would be almost kind of boilerplate, but there's a lot more intellectual bite than one might imagine, and that a commitment to the well-being of all sentience is, if you think through its implications, an extraordinarily radical commitment to make, and it was Nick more than anyone else who ensured it's there. Yeah, I think even many transhumanists would balk at some of the more far-reaching implications of what this commitment entails, and clearly the ramifications if one, for example, believes in the possibility of digital sentience are profound. As someone who is a skeptic about digital sentience, in some ways I am less troubled by the possibility of, for example, us creating sentient life on our and implementing it in our digital computers. But I think it's extremely important that wherever possible one errs on the side of caution in ethical issues. Perhaps we should recall the lesson of Descartes and the Cartesians, who believed human animals, they were merely automata who weren't sentient, and therefore Descartes and his followers would vivisect, anaesthetize dogs and various nasty things like this. Even though I'm personally sceptical that a silicon, etc. robot would be a subject of experience, should we err on the side of caution? Yes, emphatically so. I mean, presumably we are going to make progress on consciousness and the binding problem. Not everyone would agree with this. There are Mysterians like Colin McGinn who argue that essentially humans are constitutionally incapable of solving the hard problem of consciousness. I beg to differ here, though certainly if one is a materialist, the hard problem is likely to seem insoluble. Many people are not really interested in futurology and the future if they don't feel the vision one is outlining is going to come to pass in one's lifetime. And critical to the success of transhumanism in practice, I suspect, is the idea that a cure for aging or radical superintelligence or phasing out involuntary suffering is a feasible project within the lifetime of one's audience. Now, perhaps this is unduly cynical, but nonetheless, yes, just imagine how crushing it can be if someone comes to believe that, yes, science is going to find a cure for aging, but probably a decade or two after their death. And likewise, learning that grandchildren are unlikely to go through the horrors of depression and disappointment and jealousy and all the ills of the flesh. If one is suffering oneself, that can be scant consolation. Really, to be interesting to most people, one needs, in practice, one needs to be dangling something that will radically improve their lives either now or in the foreseeable future.